across the globe by millions, and
political power comes from the barrel of a gun, right? That's true, right? And so in America, there are 400 million barrels of guns, and the vast majority of those are in the hands of the citizenry, beings that are not human. He said with organic trends, it'll take us centuries till we can get to our little one world system. But if we use war and the threat of war, we can get there much more rapidly. What Palantir has created with artificial intelligence, with the capabilities of the NSA to gather all communication. Christian nations of Europe have been duped into slaughtering each other. We need to be very careful not to be manipulated in this way. So Barack Hussein Obama literally got his start in the political world with the full-blown open support of a well-known mass-murdering communist terrorist. Marxism was satanic. God has given us clear instructions for how we are to resist evil, how we are to hate evil.
Before we start with the interview, please could you just check that you are subscribed to the channel and you've hit the bell notifications button as well. Today I'm pleased to welcome back Alex Newman, who is the host and editor of Liberty Sentinel and also an award-winning author. Alex, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me, Kerry.
Alex, you were extremely popular. The last time I had you on, we had a total of nearly 2 million people viewed the reels that I put out, and the comments were just in their thousands. So really wanted to get you back on today. Plus, because I like what you have to say. I like the fact that you've linked everything up to God and the Creator, which is something that the evildoers ruling this world want to distract us from. My first question is, I'd like you to talk to me about communism, because that seems to be what the evildoers want to implement next in the US, in the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. What do you think about that?
Well, I think communism needs to be understood more as a smokescreen for a cabal of criminals and megalomaniacs than a real ideology. And that's not to say that there aren't really dumb people who fall for this stuff, and even some smart people, overeducated people with too many PhDs. But at its core, the idea of communism as like an economic system or a cohesive ideology is really quite silly. It doesn't make any sense. If you actually believe in the things that communists would claim to believe in, like equality and environmental justice and economic justice and these kinds of things, communism is the worst way to achieve that. I mean, when you have a communist system, you have a tiny ruling class and a giant class of slaves. So if you really believe in equality, this is the most utterly ridiculous way of pursuing it. But when you dig beneath the veneer, I think the essence of communism is essentially an inversion of what the Bible teaches. And you can look at that on every point. So God says, thou shalt not murder. The communists, including Karl Marx, say, well, there's all kinds of people we need to murder. I mean, some of them aren't even people, right? Like the unborn babies, we got to get rid of them if they're inconvenient. But for example, the Scottish Highlanders, right? Karl Marx had a thing about exterminating the Scottish Highlanders. He said they hadn't even reached the capitalist stage. Like, of course we need to wipe them out. If they haven't even reached the capitalist stage on their own, there's no hope of them evolving to, communist utopia. So Karl Marx was an open advocate of mass murder, and of course his disciples, if you will call them that, over the years, whether we're talking about Lenin or Stalin or Mao or Pol Pot or Fidel Castro or Che Guevara or any of these people, they also have been mass murderers. So the very first command there, very significant, thou shalt not murder. Clearly, they don't pay attention to that. The next big one, thou shalt not steal. Communism is essentially based on the idea of stealing everything from everyone, because private property is wrong. Of course, God himself is the one who ordained private property. When he said, thou shalt not steal, he created a right to private property. Of course, you can't steal something unless somebody has a right to own something. And that's really the foundation of a free society, is private property rights. So Karl Marx said, no, we have to get rid of all private property. The state will consolidate it all and then redistribute the stolen loot as we see fit. Ten Commandments teach that we should not covet. We should not be envious of the things that our neighbor has. We shouldn't covet his house or his car or his wife or whatever. Communism, Marxism, is like based on covetousness. Hey, that guy has more than me. His house is bigger. His car is nicer. He owns a factory and I just work in it. And so I want to have that. And in fact, I want to have it so bad, I will steal it. I will kill him. So communism is satanic at its core. If you look at Karl Marx and even the people who were promoting these ideas before him, they also very openly wage war on the institutions that God designed. First and foremost among them, of course, the family, marriage and family. Marx believed that women should be held in common, that the family was a bourgeois institution that was perpetuating oppression, and that poor women were being oppressed by their mean old husbands, and that abolishing the patriarchy was essential for human progress. And, you go back to the scriptures, whose idea was it to create family? Well, that was God's idea. You go back to the Garden of Eden, right? He created Adam and Eve to be together because it wasn't good for man to be alone. And of course, marriage, the New Testament teaches us, is a representation of the relationship between Christ and the church. So this is a very significant institution that God has created, and so it should be no surprise that we find the Marxists and the communists trying to overturn that. Another really important one is nation states, right? Karl Marx wanted to abolish nations and turn us all into this big global brotherhood of man. Well, again, it was God's idea to divide mankind into nations. You read in Deuteronomy 32, you read in Acts 17, God established the boundaries of their dwelling places. So it was God's idea to divide mankind into nations. You can read that story in Genesis chapter 11, where he told them to spread out. They built a big tower, so God forced the issue. So on every issue, what we see is an inversion of what the Bible teaches. And I think the one who best summarized this all was actually a pastor who had a lot of firsthand experience. His name was Richard Wurmbrand, a Romanian pastor who was ruthlessly tortured for many years by communist savages in a gulag in Romania. And his conclusion was that Marxism was satanic. And one of the pieces of evidence that he brought to bear, I actually just did a major article on this for the New American Magazine. We're doing a special issue on conspiracy. Communism is at its core a conspiracy. It's two or more people behind the scenes working for evil purposes. And I actually want to quote a couple of these poems because they're just so clear about what Marx was really up to. We've got here a poem called Invocation of One in Despair, where Marx says, "So a God has snatched from me my all, in the curse and rack of destiny. All his worlds are gone beyond recall. Nothing but revenge is left to me. I shall build my throne high overhead. Cold, tremendous shall its summit be." If you think about what we know from the scriptures about Lucifer, the angel that wanted to overthrow God and claim his throne, that's exactly what we're talking about here. Marx is saying, I hate you, God. I'm going to build my throne higher than yours. It almost sounds like Satan speaking. We've got another poem by Marx called The Player. Marx says, "The hellish vapors rise and fill the brain till I go mad, and my heart is utterly changed. See this sword? The Prince of Darkness sold it to me." He goes on to say in this thing, "With Satan I have struck my deal. He chalks the signs, beats time for me. I play the death march fast and free." He's got another one, The Pale Maiden. He says, "Thus heaven I've forfeited, I know it full well. My soul, once true to God, is chosen for hell." So these are not the poems or the ramblings of somebody who believes religion is an opiate of the masses and, God is a little cute delusion for us quaint little dumb Christians. These are the words of a man who clearly hates God from the deepest parts of his soul and is determined to wage war against him if possible and against everything he ordained and created if that's not possible. So I think that's really critical to understanding Marxism. There's this notion that if we just show them that our logic is superior, then suddenly the communists are going to give up and become little Catholic baloney. Right? It was never about a coherent, reasonable ideology. That was always just a smokescreen to enlist a bunch of useful idiots, and that's what we got today.
Yeah, I know somebody that actually was affected by communism because they live in Romania, and this was only a few decades ago this ended. They said that they had telephones in the house, the ones that you plug in that time up to the 80s, and if you said anything negative about the government, about the regime, somebody would come to the house, take you out, and you would never see them again. That's number one. They also said that if you grew food, they were all starving, because apparently the reason why they had it was because they'd got in debt. So then the country needed communism to pay this debt back. So everybody was on the same wage. Everybody was very hungry. They were growing they weren't allowed to grow their own food, even in the garden. All the food had to be shared. So this is how serious communism is. And you just imagine nowadays what the government would do if they introduced communism with people's mobile phones. We've got a lot more technology now to listen into what people are saying, haven't we?
Absolutely. And when you combine what Palantir has created with artificial intelligence, with the capabilities of the NSA to gather all communications that take place through electronic means, and even non-communication. I mean, you could just be sitting there with your iPhone sitting near you, or your Android sitting near you. They can activate the microphone and gather all that. All of that data is being put into these giant server farms, data centers, and all of it is going to be, if it hasn't been already, mined by artificial intelligence, so that they will build a comprehensive profile on everybody. You don't even have to have said anything subversive to find yourselves in the crosshairs. If you just have some of the same traits as people who say subversive things, the AI will do the pattern recognition and say, this guy is a likely candidate for waking up and for disagreeing with what we're trying to do here. So it's a very dangerous system. And I've spoken with people from the NSA. I interviewed William Binney, who was the technical director of the NSA until he resigned after he found out they were using his technology to spy on everyone all the time. He says they have access to every single communication, every email, every text message, every phone call. And it's true, they don't have enough bureaucrats to go through it all right now. But when you combine it with the AI systems that are already in existence, you have basically panopticon, where everyone is under surveillance all the time. And that changes people's behavior. That changes how people are willing to speak. Just the fact that we know it exists is a problem in and of itself, let alone the capabilities of this thing. So if these megalomaniacs get their way, the global system they intend to foist on us is, I believe, more draconian and more tyrannical than anything that the worst barbarians of the 20th century, whether we're talking about Ceausescu in Romania, whether we're talking about Castro, Pol Pot, doesn't matter. It will be orders of magnitude worse than what they were capable of, because they didn't have the technology or the resources to fully implement their sick agenda. Now that is not an obstacle anymore.
Do you see that coming in, or do you see people overturning it? I mean, this is biblical, isn't it?
Yes, it is biblical. It is absolutely biblical. The article that I mentioned that we just did for that special issue in the New American on conspiracy, that's my whole point. We trace this all the way back to the garden, the rebellion of Lucifer. I mean, this has been the story of the world from the very beginning, and this continues to be biblical. And there are a lot of prophecies in the Bible that I think bear studying. I don't think we need to take a fatalistic view, but I do think we need to be real. We need to recognize that the way the Bible presents reality is, in fact, accurate in every respect. And, I'm not one of those people who says we're definitely going to get raptured next week, or, the Antichrist beast global government is just around the corner, there's nothing we can do. Whether that's true or not, and it may well be true, but whether it's true or not, that doesn't absolve us of our responsibilities. God has given us clear instructions for how we are to resist evil, how we are to hate evil, in fact. Over and over and over again, God says to fear the Lord, to love the Lord is to hate evil. We must resist this evil. And for 2,000 years, Christians have resisted this evil, not necessarily with violence, but with love and with truth. And that is even a bigger threat than resistance with violence. So I would encourage people to study their Bibles. That's where you will really get the answers to the important questions in life, and you'll have a much clearer picture of what's going on. But I don't believe that liberty is going to necessarily end in the near future just because these evil megalomaniacs are planning for that to happen. Yes, they plan, but they've been planning this kind of stuff forever, right? They have always sought to steal people's freedom and destroy. And, I believe ultimately God is sovereign. And so we have two ditches that people fall into on this issue. You have the people who mistakenly ascribe sovereignty to Satan, and so everything that happens is Satan, right? A candidate gets elected, and he sounds really great, but he must be some part of this satanic plan, because otherwise he couldn't have won the election. I think that's a really fatalistic view, and it ascribes to Satan characteristics that belong only to God, attributes that are only properly assigned to God, like sovereignty, like ultimate control over everything. And then there's the other ditch, which is, there's no Satan, there's no evil, everything's fine, nothing to see here. And a lot of people fall into that ditch too, the people who would just rather watch the football game, the soccer game, whatever, instead of paying attention to what's going on. I think we need to take a path right down the middle where Paul says we are not ignorant of Satan's devices, but hey, go read Romans chapter 16. Paul says to the church at Rome that the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. And that was true then. They were living in a pagan dictatorship. that was ruthlessly persecuting and terrorizing Christians, feeding them to lions, and sacrificing children, and orgies at the temple, and all this kind of stuff. And you could imagine Paul probably sounded kind of ridiculous. Oh yeah, God in peace is going to crush Satan under your feet. Well, guess what? The entire Roman Empire came crumbling down, and Christianity was victorious. And all those wicked practices of the pagans and the Satan worshippers went underground, went into the closet, and Christendom was born. So I believe that's entirely possible. I don't know what God's timeline is. I think it's worth studying. If God says it in prophecy, you can take it to the bank. It's going to happen. About a third of the Bible is prophecy, and a lot of it has already come true. So we should study prophecy, but we shouldn't use prophecy or biblical understandings of things as an excuse not to do the things that God has commanded us to do, like raise up our children, like resist evil, etc.
I mean, you say that Christians are peaceful, but I think Christians have also got a lot to learn as well. For example, they've been radicalized just like most people to go to kill, to be soldiers, to go to other countries. Like, that's been radicalized through Hollywood, that, the sort of hero British soldier, the hero American soldier. And I think that's taken people down the wrong road as well, going to another country and fighting a war. And that's why for the cabal. And that's why we're seeing so many veterans come out of that, with PTSD, committing can't say it on here, but you know what I mean. Because they then realise what they've done and they can't handle it. So I think we should also, be more followers of Christ, which is thou shalt not kill, I think, rather than Christian.
And I want to point out here, Kerry, you're right. Christians are called to be peaceful. In fact, Jesus is the Prince of Peace. But if you read the Scriptures, God is also the God of armies. And God repeatedly portrays us as soldiers in a war. Now, it is primarily a spiritual war, but there are sometimes physical manifestations of it. And, I don't think Christians have ever regarded, for the most part, mainstream Christians have ever regarded all war as necessarily bad. If Christians had taken that position, the Christendom would have been eradicated many centuries ago, when Islamic armies came over and over and over trying to conquer what became known as Christendom. They managed to conquer the Iberian Peninsula, which they occupied for hundreds of years. They tried to conquer all the way up into France. They were turned back by Charles Martel in the 8th century. They tried to conquer through Central Europe. Luckily, they were stopped at the gates of Vienna multiple times. The Islamic navies came and tried to conquer Europe. Thankfully, they were stopped at the Battle of Lepanto. And so Christians are sometimes called to defend themselves and their families and their faith and their countries from evil. And so Christian theologians, going back 2,000 years now, have worked on this idea of what's called just war theory. And really, if you go back, the genesis of this is over 1,500 years old. You've got Augustine commenting on this. And so historically, the biblical understanding is that there is a such thing as a just war, but certain criteria have to be met. I would argue, for example, that what's going on in Iran right now probably doesn't meet the definition of just war. Certainly what happened in Iraq, what we did in Syria, what we did in Libya, what we did in Afghanistan, none of those things, I would argue, fall under just war theory. But there is a such thing as a just war. And if the alternative, people forget that Jesus wasn't always Mr. Lovey-Dovey. He talked about, I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword, right? He urged his followers in Luke, if you don't have a cloak, go out and, if you don't have a sword, which, today the modern equivalent of that would be AR-15, M16. If you don't have a sword, go out and sell your cloak and buy one. Now, Jesus was not a violent man, but when he comes back, you can read that in Revelation chapter 19, chapter 20, you will see he's coming back leading an army. And he is going to absolutely crush all of his enemies with military force. He comes back riding a white horse. So, again, there's these two different facets of God. Yes, he is merciful, but he is also just. And those things can and do coexist within the person of God. And you're right that Christians frequently get manipulated by evildoers into believing that there's somehow something Christian about going to wage war on the enemies of the deep state, the enemies of the evildoers, and that's very dangerous. So I think the key thing here is to study our Bibles and to understand that there is a time where we are sometimes called to defend our families. If somebody came across the border of the United States and was threatening to wipe out my wife and my children, I would absolutely pick up arms. And you know, the only denominations of Christians historically who have rejected that are rather fringe sects, like certain folks in the Anabaptist, and I love the Anabaptists, by the way, but certain folks in the Anabaptist tradition that you know, they would allow their family to be massacred in front of their face rather than pick up a weapon to defend them. So again, I think we got the ditches on both sides, and we need to be careful not to fall into either one.
Yeah, I was actually meaning this century, the wars this century,
Yeah.
but I didn't say that, and I let you answer anyway, because I was learning quite a lot there. I absolutely agree that you should defend yourself, and if somebody brings a sword to you, you should, you know, have a sword back, and I think that's in the Bible as well. But I'm more meaning the wars of this century, particularly in the Middle East, that they're getting us. I mean, British, you know, the Five Eyes, which for anyone watching who doesn't know that's the US, Canada, Australia, UK.
In fact, they understood that World War I was the greatest engine of social change ever, right? They sent the men all off to die in the war, and nobody even remembers what it was about. Like, oh, Archduke got shot. Oh, okay, so we need to kill millions of people? Like, you know, that didn't make any sense. But they sent the men off to go die in the war. They forced the women into the factories because the men were off dying in the wars. And they said, oh, children, they don't have a mom at home to take care of them. We'll put them in the government schools. And so radical transformation. That gave birth to the League of Nations. World War II also engineered. You know, for the folks who don't realize that Hitler was financed by the same evildoers we're talking about, go pick up a copy of Stanford historian Anthony Sutton's book, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, financed by Rockefeller interests, Morgan interests, all the usual suspects, including the Bush dynasty. Prescott Bush ended up in hot water as a director of Union Bank of New York under the Trading with the Enemy Act. So again, both sides here, we see the evildoers behind the scenes. And I think the clearest explanation of why they're doing this was articulated in a 1962 report commissioned by the U.S. State Department called The World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations, where they said that the fastest way to get to a global government, a world effectively controlled by the UN, would be to use war, the threat of war, and grave crises. They actually say in the report, the guy who wrote it is Lincoln Bloomfield, a member of the Deep State Council on Foreign Relations. He said, with organic trends, it'll take us centuries till we can get to our little one world system. But if we use war and the threat of war, we can get there much more rapidly. And that's exactly what we've seen. Right? In the aftermath of World War II, we got the United Abominations, the United Nations. We got the World Bank. We got the International Monetary Fund. The Europeans got what they called the European Coal and Steel Community, which very rapidly morphed into this totalitarian superstate called the European Union. So you're absolutely right, Kerry, that we have been duped. The Christian nations of Europe have been duped into slaughtering each other by people who wouldn't know Christ if he slapped them in the face. So we need to be very careful not to be manipulated in this way. We need to use discernment, and we need to use the Bible as our guide to all these kinds of questions, especially of things as important as war or peace.
Yeah, it is a bit concerning, because a lot of people, not enough though, are waking up to what they're trying to get, you know, us to do, especially in Europe. But I guess, yeah, because not enough people have realised, they're still falling for it. You know, they don't really understand that they are being manipulated. And so, yeah, I am concerned that maybe the evildoers will force people, the young, fit, fighting men and women, you know, as a part of a depopulation regime, to actually draft them into war. And if they don't go to war, they're going to go to prison. Now, hopefully everyone's just going to choose prison, because obviously if millions of people say no, they're going to have no success. So this is why I want to do interviews like this, so people don't think, yeah, I'm going to go defend my nation. It's like, no, don't think like that anymore. Let's stop all killing each other in Europe and the Middle East, right? Looking at the Bible, who do you actually think these evildoers are? Like, if we think about shapeshifters, giants, fallen angels, reptilians, Cain descendants, have you sort of worked out, and do you think that's who they are?
Well, I think we need to look at this biblically through a number of different lenses, right? We know that we're dealing with spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. The Bible teaches that explicitly. The Apostle Paul in Ephesians chapter 6 gives, I think, the clearest explanation of that, where he talks about we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and the forces of darkness and spiritual wickedness in high places or in the heavenly places. And that is clearly a reference to beings that are not human. We're talking about celestial beings, what people typically think of as angels and demons. Our struggle, of course, being against demons. There are fallen angels. The Bible alludes to the fact that about a third of the angels followed Lucifer in his rebellion. And, I as a Bible-believing Christian, I take this literally. I believe that there were literally angels, and literally some of them followed an actual being known as Lucifer, now Satan, in rebellion against their creator, against the Most High God. And we see this being interacting with humanity, and those that followed him interacting with humanity throughout human history, going all the way back to Genesis chapter 3 in the garden, where Satan comes as a snake and says, hey, did God really say, right? Notice questioning the authority of God's word. Hey, you could be like God, right? You could live forever. You won't surely die. You'll know good in you. It's the same lie that Satan's minions today use, same collection of lies. So I think there is clearly superhuman intelligences, beings of various sorts. And the Bible talks about different types of these beings. And people always get real uncomfortable when you talk about this because it's not like for polite Christian company in America anymore. But, we have different categories of angels. We have seraphim and we have cherubim. And so there's all kinds of these celestial beings that we typically don't perceive with our five senses, but that doesn't mean they're not there. And sometimes we do perceive them with our five senses. There's a lot of accounts throughout the scriptures of angels coming to human beings. And sometimes, the Bible says, you might even entertain an angel unaware. So it's certainly possible that some of these beings come looking and sounding very much like a regular person. So I think that's one of the things that we're dealing with. But I don't think we should discount also the importance of our sin nature, right? A lot of the struggles that we deal with in the here and now in the physical world are caused by our own sin nature and the sin nature of other people. Jeremiah says their heart is desperately wicked. Who can know it, right? They're constantly greedy for more money and more fame and more power, and they'll stab their mother in the back to get that. And these people wreak havoc on their fellow human beings. And so we shouldn't discount that. There are wicked people. In fact, the Bible teaches that people are wicked, at least until they are regenerated and surrender their lives to Christ. So I think those are two of the big ones that we're dealing with. We've got the world, we've got the flesh, we've got the devil. We talked about the devil, we talked about the flesh. The last one is the kind of the world system, if you will, which Christians have always understood we are at war with, right? Not in like the sense of like, pick up a gun, but in the sense of the world system is at odds with the gospel. The world system hates Christians. The world system is determined to perpetrate evil. And I think it's controlled by a mixture of both these powers and principalities that Paul talks about, and also wicked, sinful men who knowingly or unknowingly have thrown in their lot with these evil, supernatural, superhuman beings. And I think as Christians, we need to be careful here because it's easy to fall into the temptation to hate these people. Whether God loves everyone or not, that's a theological question. I think it's worth discussing. But we were commanded by Jesus to love our enemies, to pray for those who persecute us, to overcome evil with good. And so we as Christians, we need to be careful not to hate those people who are responsible for this. And if we're honest with ourselves, the reality is we were all in that same boat with them, heading to the same destination before we were pulled out of the muck by Jesus Christ. And so that's the lens that I look at it through. I was very, very much lost before I came to know the Lord. And so I even have some sympathy for these evildoers who still don't maybe see it all, still don't realize it all. Yes, they're working for the enemy. Jesus talks about the kingdom of darkness. He says you people are of your father, the devil. I mean, those are some really strong words. This notion that Jesus was always Mr. Nice Guy. Just go read what he said. He called the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He said you're of your father, the devil. He said you're a brood of vipers. Like, who's going to save you from hell? He said you're like whitewashed tombs. We should be more Christ-like sometimes, I think, right? and call out these people. But we do it in love. We do it in truth, not because we hate them, but because we want them to lay down their weapons, surrender their lives to their Creator, and be adopted into the family of God.
Yeah, and just for people to understand the importance of sin, it's the way I'm looking at it now is that we are EMFs, we are frequencies. That's why we're called human, H-U-E, right? We're hues of EMFs. What does it stand for, EMFs? Something I can't remember.
Electromagnetic.
Yeah. And so if you're doing what let's say Satan is trying to get you to do, which is binge eat candy, drink lots of alcohol, take drugs. This is then putting you on a different frequency. Or if you're, doing the other things that we all know are sinful. I don't want to say the words though, because you know what I mean.
Like the algorithm will get you.
Yeah, the one beginning with P, P-O, ends with N. Yeah. So these sorts of things, like this brings your frequency down. So this is why you don't want to be caught by, and that's why the devil is in charge of all those kind of industries as well, and the Satan, because he's bringing our frequency down. And I think so God doesn't want those sorts of people in heaven next to him, because if you think you've got all these children what they're doing is going to affect you. So he needs to have only people next to him that are at this high level of frequency, so he can operate properly. So if everyone's sinning, that's why I think the frequency is going to hell. Whether it's literally going to hell or whether you're just going to become fire down there, I don't know. But it's a different frequency. And so to not sin is to not change your God-given frequency by doing all those things that they're throwing at us, which is why they throw consumerism at us as well. Because again, that gets us away from God, because it's making us, addicted to all this nonsense that doesn't bring any pleasure, lasting pleasure and happiness at all. Yeah. What do you think?
And the Bible teaches on that clearly. In fact, just yesterday we were studying 1 John chapter 2, where Jesus is explaining through the Holy Spirit and through the human writer, John, that if you love me, you will keep my commandments. How do you know that you are with Christ? Well, you're going to not want to sin. So our flesh is still lusting after these sinful desires, but we are then waging war on that, and of course Christ is with us. But you're absolutely right. God is holy. He says it over and over again. In fact, that's what the angels are singing in heaven right now. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. And God is perfectly holy, and he's perfectly just, and so he cannot be around sin. Sin is absolutely abhorrent to him, and that's why Christians who put on the righteousness of Christ are able to then access the throne of God, but why unbelievers who are still dead in their sin are not able to. God cannot be around sin, and so there's this impenetrable barrier that only Christ can help us cross.
Yeah, and I've never been happier since I asked the Holy Spirit to come enter my body, and I'm actually probably the happiest I've ever been in my life right now.
This is one of the fruits of the Spirit, right? So,
yeah. So, what do you think is the mark of the beast? Because there's been a lot of chat about that, particularly because there's 50,000 people in the world that have got these neuro links in the brain and chips in the right hand, just like is in your dog, the microchip in the dog, which they started it in first. But people are in China, and even some in the US. I've seen a girl in the US, she paid for her groceries with this chip in her hand. What do you think the mark of the beast is?
It's a very good question, and I've given talks on this. I think it's important to start by saying I don't know, and I don't think anybody does. And when somebody tells you they definitely know what it is, I think we should look at that with suspicion. There are different movements that have claimed to know. For example, the Seventh-day Adventists, they claim it's being forced to work on the Sabbath. I don't agree with them on that, even though I certainly don't want to force them to violate their consciences by working on the Sabbath, right? I get it. But when I look around, I encourage people to just read Revelation 13, read Revelation 14, read Revelation 18. There's only a very small handful of references to this mark of the beast, but we know a few things about it. We know from Revelation 13 that this global system will require everyone, big and small, great and lowly, to receive this mark either in their right hand or in their forehead if they want to be able to engage in commerce, if they want to be able to buy or sell. And it says for those who will not take it, they will not be able to buy or sell. So that's one thing that we know about it. If you don't take it, you won't be able to buy or sell. That right there, I think, really should evoke memories of what we just lived through with this COVID thing. No, you can't go to the grocery store. No, you can't go to a restaurant. You can't do anything. You can't go on public transport. You can't do anything if you won't get this injection and prove with your little app or whatever jurisdiction you lived in that you've taken this injection. That's very troubling. Now, I'm not saying the COVID injection was the mark of the beast. In fact, I don't believe it was. But I believe the parallels between what we read in the scriptures and what we just saw are very obvious, and so this could be kind of a precursor to that kind of system, laying down the infrastructure that would come behind it. Now, another thing that we know about the mark of the beast is that once you take it, you are unredeemable, right? Christ can forgive pretty much anything, right? I mean, like blasphemy of the Holy Spirit is listed as the one thing that can't be forgiven, and then taking this mark of the beast. Once you take it, that's it, right? There's no more hope for you. You're done. It's over. And so, why is that? Why can Christ forgive mass murder? Why can he forgive a concentration camp guard who sent innocent women and children to their deaths, but he can't forgive someone who took this mark? Well, I don't know for sure, but we're looking at some of these technologies that are coming down the pike. I mean, you mentioned Neuralink. You've got Elon Musk running around saying that we're going to have to merge with AI or we're going to be obsolete. My only conclusion is, and again, I'm just speculating here, and I don't want anybody to say, well, Alex Newman said this. It's not. I'm not saying that. But to me, it seems like this mark of the beast must take away some element of your humanity, right? Whether it's by merging your mind with this artificial intelligence, Borg or whatever that's being built right now. I mean, and again, you mentioned Elon Musk's Neuralink. I mean, that is the connection between the human brain and the Borg. Whether it's these mRNA injections that are quite literally altering the genetic code that God Himself wrote for you, those would be reasonable candidates, in my opinion, for being possible mark of the beast. But I will say this, and there are people who say that maybe this is something that's repeated throughout history. There was a time in the ancient Roman Empire when Christians were being ruthlessly persecuted, where the emperor put out a decree that anybody who won't worship and sacrifice and claim that the emperor is God, and they have his little leave-a-loose to prove it, wouldn't be able to buy or sell, right? And so that's a historical thing that happened, and a lot of people looked at the prophecies and said, aha, there it is, the mark of the beast. Was that the mark of the beast? I don't know. But when I look at the direction we're going, it seems to me like it's got to be, assuming it's a future event, and I believe it is, it seems to me it's got to be something that's, first of all, conscience. I don't think you can be tricked into taking the mark of the beast. I think you're going to have to think about it and say, well, I prefer being able to buy and sell and the comfort that comes with that than Christ. And so you're making a conscious decision knowing that, all right, I'm rejecting Christ and I'm accepting this wicked system, and of course the father of that system. So those are my thoughts on it. I know it's kind of rambling, and I wish I had something more concrete, but the reality is with prophecies, they give us kind of a vague outline of what's coming, but it's only in retrospect that we look at it and say, wow, that was so obvious, right? And this was the case even with the arrival of Christ. There were hundreds of prophecies telling us everything about what the coming of the Messiah was going to look like, right? I mean, Isaiah 53, Psalm 22. I mean, you go back to the Old, you could preach the gospel out of the Old Testament very easily. And yet you had all these experts, right? All these super experts in the Bible. And Jesus arrives and fulfills every one of those hundreds of prophecies in a way that's completely impossible. I mean, the odds of that happening with one person are so small that it's impossible. And yet you have all these experts who didn't see it. So yeah, we always have to be very, very careful. I think we always have to approach prophecy with an overwhelming sense of our own inadequacy and a huge sense of humility. But I guess those are my thoughts on Mark of the Beast.
Yeah, and just before we move on to another point, I just want to say it would be very foolish to take the mark of the beast. If you think about who's running the world, who's not getting sent to jail for what's been done recently, or the rumours of it. But if you think about what they're up to, who these people are, and you're going to take their mark, and then they can do whatever they want with your brain. They could wipe your memory. They could put somebody else's memory in yours. They could make you angry. They could put some thoughts in your head that's complete anger and go, murder your fellow neighbours. They can do whatever they want. I would rather starve to death, if that is what is needed, than take that mark of the beast. What do you think?
Absolutely. And I'll remind people too, our God is sovereign. Our God created the heavens and the earth out of nothing. Like, if you think that God isn't capable of feeding you if you won't take some goofy mark, just go back and read the scriptures. He fed Elijah using a bunch of nasty birds, right? God is the one who creates all things, the cattle on 1,000 hills. Every square inch of this universe belongs to him. And so really it's an idle threat. It's an empty threat. Jesus actually says something very profound, and it's not in the context of the mark of the beast, but he says, hey, look at the birds. Like, they're not sowing and reaping and storing up grain from the harvest. Like, and yet your Heavenly Father feeds them, right? He said, look at those flowers in the field. Like, they're not worried about, buying clothes and stuff. And yet your Heavenly Father clothes them in ways that are more glorious than even Solomon was arrayed, right? And he says, how about you? You're way more valuable to your Father than flowers in the field or little birds, right? You think your Heavenly Father won't feed you? And so if we are honored enough to suffer for Christ in a way that requires us to endure some hardship, we should count it all joy. And so, for me, it's not even a question; it's a no-brainer. Eternity in hell apart from God, or a brief moment of discomfort because I'm hungry. It's not even a question.
Exactly, because you'll be somewhere great afterwards, after the end.
For eternity, right? For eternity. Eternity's a long time, ladies and gentlemen. Your life is but a vapor, right? It's here 1 second, it's gone the next. Forget about this present moment. Keep eternity always in mind.
Absolutely. So, talking about the Weather Underground that they used to teach in schools, I guess my question is, do they teach about the Weather Underground in schools today, in 2026? And how was Barack Obama related to Bill Ayers in his dealings with him? And then there was another lady as well in California, and I've forgotten her name now.
You're talking about Linda Darling Hammond?
I'm not sure.
But I think you might be talking about Linda Darling Hammond. She was close with Barack Obama. She was close with a number of these characters, and she was deeply involved in education in the state of California, like so many other people who got their start with the Weather Underground. So
just tell us a bit about what happened and whether children have been taught about it today or whether it's been brushed under the carpet, and then kind of what the threat of communism or what could be brewing up now in the States.
So Bill Ayers, started a terrorist group called the Weather Underground, and they were very vicious. They bombed the State Department, they bombed the Pentagon, they bombed the Capitol, it's where our Congress is headquartered. They were murdering police officers, robbing money trucks. Then they would bomb the funerals of the police officers so they could kill some of their friends and family and fellow police officers. Horrible group, and they were working, we now know, closely with the DGI, which is Communist Cuban Intelligence, which of course was basically an extension of the Soviet KGB, and their goal was to strike terror in the hearts of Americans. Now, the FBI sent an infiltrator into the leadership of the Weather Underground. His name was Larry Grathwohl, great American, and he made it all the way. He penetrated the inner leadership circle of the Weather Underground. And he revealed in a series of interviews after his work was done that they had a plan to try to kick off a revolution in the United States of America. Their plan involved bringing hostile foreign powers to occupy various parts of the country. So they were going to have the Cubans occupy the southeast, Florida. They were going to have the Russians occupy parts of the north and parts of the east coast. They'd have the Communist Chinese and the North Koreans take parts of the west, various Latin American governments taking parts of the south. And they were going to create a network of concentration camps, this whistleblower who worked for the FBI said, Larry Grathwohl. And he said they expected to intern tens of millions of Americans, primarily for re-education purposes. But Larry asked these leaders of this terrorist movement what they were going to do with those of us, people like me, who could not be brought into the new way of thinking, who just simply could not be re-educated because they were clinging too closely to their beliefs. And the answer was, well, they're going to have to be liquidated. They're going to be exterminated. And they expected that they'd have to exterminate about 25 million Americans. That would be about 10% of the population, based on the history of communist regimes. Depending on which one you're looking at, about an appropriate number, right? Some have killed many more, like Pol Pot, some a little bit less, but that's about an accurate number based on what we've seen historically. And that was their plan, right? That was their plan. So their plan ended up failing. I don't think America was as ready for communist revolution as they hoped that it was. We still had our institutions were strong enough to resist. We still had families that were strong enough to resist. And so they kind of went back to the drawing board. Now, Bill Ayers was, in fact, prosecuted, but he was let off on a technicality, and he bragged about this. Oh, I'm guilty as sin, but free as a bird, right? So he knew that he was very guilty. He celebrated the fact that he was very guilty, and he got off on a technicality. Welcome to the American justice system, right? Where innocent people go to prison, and Epstein Associates don't, right? Very so, and people like that. So Bill Ayers decided that, well, he decided a number of things, but he said one of the big failings with their revolution was that the business community hadn't been brought on board yet. He thought that they needed to do a better job of penetrating the big companies of the world, the Fortune 500, the business leadership class, because that would facilitate the revolution. And he also believed that education was going to be the key. So he actually went into education after his terrorist days. He went and became a professor of education to try to influence future educators. Was very successful in that capacity. He raised up a whole army of little disciples who then fanned out across the country and got themselves into positions of leadership within the education system. And then the nexus with Barack Obama is very interesting too. Bill Ayers and Barack Obama knew each other, and in fact, it's a very interesting story. Nobody had ever heard of Barack Obama until Bill Ayers hosted an event at his house in his living room to kick off his campaign for Illinois State Senate. So Barack Hussein Obama literally got his start in the political world with the full-blown open support of a well-known mass-murdering communist terrorist. Now, if you read Barack Obama's own writings, he was very much inspired by other communist revolutions. In fact, he frequently discusses South Africa as his inspiration for getting involved. The first political speech he ever gave when he was in college was about South Africa. And so there's a really, really strong communist undercurrent, not just with Bill Ayers, not just with the things that he has said, but all around this whole issue. And to your point, Kerry, very few young Americans today know anything about the Weather Underground. This is not something that's taught. And to the extent that young Americans know anything about those very tumultuous days in our country, the terrorists are portrayed very sympathetically. Oh, they just civil rights and, black people. And, they just throw out the standard slogans that we're supposed to be conditioned to just, immediately start drooling like Pavlov's dogs. Oh, well, he said civil rights. And so, clearly this was a good movement. No, this was a murderous movement. It was a terrorist movement. All the leaders should have been imprisoned for life if society was feeling generous. But unfortunately, they went into education and started brainwashing the next generation, and they've been very successful.
Yeah, well, thank you for, obviously some youngsters are going to be watching this video now, so your work's really important to educate them on the truth of what's going on, because it sounds like they're not teaching them in school anymore.
That this
happened.
Not.
So who else is in politics now, still working in politics, that is also involved in, a communism revolution in the US? Because I think the US compared to Europe, because you guys have still got your guns, and this is so important. If you look at what's happening in Europe right now, they've had their guns taken away, but you guys are like, no, we're not going to get them taken away. And I think that's really saving the States right now.
No question. I agree with you 100%. And I think the Second Amendment is one of the reasons why America still retains as many freedoms as it does. Chairman Mao, as much of a mass-murdering monster as he was, he understood, as he put it, that political power comes from the barrel of a gun. Right? That's true. Right? And so in America, there are 400 million barrels of guns, and the vast majority of those are in the hands of the citizenry. And many of those citizens are highly trained, whether that be from years hunting in the woods and shooting deer at 800 yards, or whether that be from combat experience in Iraq and Afghanistan and whatever special operations hellhole they were deployed to, or law enforcement. So we've got a lot of Americans who are highly trained and very well armed, and that makes it difficult for the evildoers to just come out openly and try to take us over. And they know that. So I think their strategy for dealing with that is to try to stir up a civil war, try to get Americans to hate each other, try to get Americans to think that fellow Americans are the real enemy. And so they're working on that right now very effectively. Another country that has very wisely maintained its weaponry, its armed citizenry, is Switzerland. And I lived many years in Switzerland. It wasn't unusual at all on a Friday to get on the train and see a bunch of guys in jeans come on board with a fully automatic machine gun over their shoulder. It wasn't unusual at all to see a little 12-year-old girl ride down the street on a bicycle with a very nice rifle slung over her shoulder on her way to the shooting range. And guess what? The Swiss have had a lot of peace for a lot of centuries. In fact, Adolf Hitler looked at Switzerland and said, 3 million heavily armed men who could shoot an apple off a fly's butt at a mile away. I think we'll pass. We'll just hide some of our money in the Swiss banks and just leave it at that, right? And that's always been the case. Nobody wants to invade Switzerland because every man in Switzerland, when he turns 18, is given a fully automatic machine gun. He's ordered to learn how to use it. He typically keeps it in his cupboard or in his closet. And so Switzerland would be the last place in the world that you would want to invade. You add to that strong decentralized government, locally controlled police forces, lack of a standing army. In Switzerland, every man is part of the militia, which is what our founding fathers wanted to have here in the United States. And you have a recipe for security. The Swiss have been able to maintain their liberty completely surrounded by tyrannical governments for many, many centuries. So our founding fathers looked at that and said, that sounds like a good plan, and that's how we ended up with these freedoms in America. Yes, they want to take our guns. They know they're not going to be able to do that, and so I think they're hoping that we will turn them on each other.
Yes, and also false flags are created in order to get people to think guns are bad. Yep. Listen, thank you so much, Alex, for coming on today. Really, really appreciate it. Could you tell me, have you got any books out right now that is going to help the public, especially if they've got children? What book have you got out? What's your latest book?
Well, thank you, Kerry. So my newest book, we just published it a couple of months ago. It's called Woke and Weaponized, How Karl Marx Won the Battle for American Education. I wrote that with my friend Robert Bortons. He's the CEO of Classical Conversations. It's the biggest homeschool program in the world, about 140,000 students, including my precious children. They have communities all over the country. And so this is a book where we trace the history of how the government took control of education, what these people were motivated by, and the evidence is clear. They hated God. They wanted to turn Americans against God, family, country, etc. So we tell that whole story, and then we give some really concrete ideas on how we move forward from here, because we regard this as maybe the greatest existential threat is the mass scale dumbing down, indoctrination, sexualization of our children. So we're really, really pleased with that book. People can get copies on Amazon. Again, it's called Woke and Weaponized, How Karl Marx Won the Battle for American Education and How We Can Take It Back. Before that, I did another one on education called Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. That was released last year, and that one covers a lot of the situation we're dealing with right now in the schools, the spiritual side of it, the history of what education looked like before the government took it over, and a lot of very unexpected people came alongside and endorsed that. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, General Michael Flynn, who was Trump's national security advisor in his first term. Many interesting people said, they're not really like into education, but they said this book is critical for the survival of America. So we would encourage people to get that. And then I've got a new one coming out very soon. We're in the final stages of preparing that. It's called Deep State 2.0. It's going to be a revised, updated edition to my original Deep State book that we published 5 years ago. And that'll give people kind of a comprehensive look at the enemy that we're facing and how we deal with it. So.
Yeah, and I think if you're putting things in that book that the education system isn't teaching, that's even more important, because people have been mind controlled. And I was for years, even though I was a national TV journalist and well read, I thought I've only just I'm now like whoa, you sort of you see you start to see the matrix and the mass mind controlling of humanity. So anything that is passing on the truth to the next generation and this generation is a win from me. So I'll put the links to your books down below, and I'll also put your website as well, because I think people can buy directly from you, especially if they don't want to buy from Amazon. And which are your biggest websites that you're on? I know you're on YouTube. I'll put the link. Well, we'll be collabing on this anyway for YouTube. But you're on X, aren't you, as well? And I'll put the link to that. Is there any? Where can they find you on X?
Yeah, Alex Newman _JOU is my personal one. Then we've got Liberty Sent, is for Liberty Sentinel Media. And then at New American Mag for the New American Magazine. People can find us there. And then the website's a good place to go to, because then we don't depend on the big tech overlords. You can get our newsletter directly at libertysentinel.org, and you can sign up for our free daily headlines at thenewamerican.com. Every day, 5 days a week, you'll get the real news, what's going on around the world. And so those are two good places. And then if you want to learn more on the education stuff, go to classicalconversations.com.
Yeah, I'd really like all my viewers to follow Alex, because he is a man of the Lord. Well, I don't really like saying Lord, as some people know. He's the man of the Heavenly Father, and he knows his stuff. And some of the comments that I've had, he's saying, this guy's a genius, he really knows what he's talking about. So yeah, please all follow Alex as well. Right, thank you so much, Alex, for taking the time to come on today.
Thank you, Kerry. It was an honor and a pleasure. God bless you, and I hope we can talk soon.
And please ensure that you are subscribed to the show. Just check now if you did click that bell notifications and subscribe button. What did you think to that interview? Let me know in the comments. Here's a video coming up here that's relevant to what we've been talking about today.